Kלים, Perik Chav Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. I can see trouble looming up ahead with this Mishnah. Okay, this is a rather technical Mishnah dealing with the weaving and spinning, looms and spindles. I've attached, if you can see on the screen, I've attached a very good picture of a loom from the Sefer Kלים. And I've also put in letters, my letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, J, and I will refer to the various parts of the loom as we move through the Mishnah. Before we start the Mishnah, first let's see what we're talking about. We've got a loom, and a beged is in the middle of being woven. Some of the beged is being done. You've got some beged, as seen at the bottom of the loom, roughly where the letters H and B are. You can see the woven beged wrapped around the bottom roller. And what the Mishnah is discussing is that imagine the whole loom is an oil hames. The beged becomes tummy, of course. None of the other things, none of the other bits, i.e. the rest of the threads, the other bits of the loom, and none of them by themselves are able to be makabel tumah. The threads because they're not yet made into a beged, and the rest of the loom because they're all classic pshute kleids. What we're discussing here is, when the beged becomes tummy, are there any parts of the threads and the loom which are called mechuber to the beged, so that when the beged becomes tummy, they become tummy with it, b'teiras chibur or b'teiras yodos. In other words, if the beged becomes tummy, if you were to touch, is there another part of the loom or the unwoven beged which you can touch, which will actually be metamayu b'teiras yad? That's what the Mishnah is discussing. And the first bit of the Mishnah are all a bunch of tohors. In other words, when the beged is tummy, says the Mishnah, if you were to touch these other parts, the parts which are going to be listed in the beginning of the Mishnah, you do not become tummy b'teiras yad from the beged. Obviously, we're assuming the mace has now been removed from the room. Says the Mishnah, the first one is, Hanegea b'koved ha'elyon b'koved ha'tachton. The beged is tummy. If you look at the picture, you've got two rollers, two beams, one called A and one called B. Round B, the woven beged is being rolled, and around A, the threads of the warp, in other words, the chassis, the threads which are yet to be woven, are wound. It says the Mishnah, if the beged is tummy, if you touch the roller A, or you touch the roller B, that's not called a chibur to the beged, although they're touching the beged, especially roller B, but it's not a mechuber to the beged, it's not connected in such a way that it's called a chibur. It doesn't actually serve the purpose of the ariga, it just holds the thing in place, therefore it's not a chibur, and you remain tahor. That's the first bit of koved elyon koved tachton. Next, similarly, if you touch benirim, says the Mishnah, if you look at the picture, I've got two frames which I've marked with the letter C. Those frames are called in English the harness. The harness have got, you can see, vertical threads running down it called the heddle, through which the threads of the chassis, the threads of the warp, are threaded. And there are two harnesses, because through one harness you thread every alternate warp thread, numbers 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, etc. Through the other harness you thread the other alternate warp threads, 2, 4, 6, 8. And therefore, and then by means of a pedal or manually, as you weave each line of thread across the weft, you then change them so that what was on top now comes at the bottom, and that interlocks the woven thread. That's the basic mechanism of weaving. Now those frames through which, the frames of C, through which the threads of the warp are threaded are called nirim. Says the Mishnah, those nirim are not mechuber to the beged which is tummy. Over kirus is the frame D. D is a frame which just sits right at the edge of the woven beged, separating the threads of the chassis of the weft of the warp as they're about to become part of the beged. This actually makes sure that the beged is tight. After every line of weft, of area which you've put through, you then press the D frame against the beged, tightening it, making sure that everything is in place. That's called a kirus. And again, the Mishnah is telling you, touching the kirus is not a chibur to the beged, which is wound round the roller B. Similarly, of a chut shehe'eviroi al gabe argomon. There are many explanations to this. We'll do the Baal Tanura's explanation, although it is a bit difficult to understand exactly the difference between this case and the case in the Sefer of the Mishnah. What the Baal Tanura tells us, argomon is the expensive wool which you're actually weaving. It's a precious wool. You want to protect it. So during the weaving process, you actually put other threads, loose threads, on top of the argomon to protect it from dust and other bits of dirt flying around. If it's just a chut shehe'eviroi al gabe argomon, which means that the chut is lying on the woven beged during the weaving process, but the intention is to then remove it. It's only there temporarily, therefore it is not a chibur to the beged. Uve'iro she'enoi osid lachaziro tohar. Many pshatim in this, we'll do the Tiferes Yisrael's pshat. If you look at the picture, you will see at the end of the beged, which is being woven, which is wound round the B roller, you will see I've marked two little loops, E and F. We're dealing with E. E is when you're weaving and you have thread, the cross threads, the weft thread. Sometimes you get a loop of thread. It should actually be quite tight at the edge, but sometimes you get a loop sticking out. And when you finished weaving, you suddenly you realize you've got a loop sticking out. If it's a big loop, a long loop, you're not going to keep it there. You're going to snip it off. That's called Eino Osid Lahachazira, and therefore touching that loop, because that loop is going to be snipped off, it's not a chibur to the beged. Therefore, tohar. Then the Mishnah is going to move over to those bits of the weaving process which are a chibur to the beged which has been woven. Nefesh hamaseches. We're now dealing with the erev thread. If you look at the bottom of the loom, there's a little something, a little widget called G, known as the shuttle. In the shuttle, there's wound all the erev threads, all the weft threads, which will eventually be thrown across to form the lines that are being made as the beged is woven. That's called the nefesh, because that goes through the warp threads, the chassis threads, like a nefesh inside the body. And the word maseches, of course, means an arrangement of a weaving. But Tanura learns, nefesh maseches means we're talking about the actual erev thread, the weft thread, which is being woven through. It hasn't yet been completely pressed against the beged yet, but it's inside. And you can see I've marked it with the letter H. The H has got two arrows pointing to that bit of the weft thread which is being thrown through. Says the Mishnah, if you touch that weft thread, when the beged is tomei, that's a chibur, and you become tomei. Similarly, uvishasi ha'omed. All the warp threads which are between roller A and the beged, in other words, where I've got the letter J, the upright warp threads, and of course the ones further in going through the harness, going through the nerim, all that's called the chassis ha'omed. That's the chassis which is going to be woven. That is called a chibur to the beged. Uvakofel sheviroi al gabi ha'argomon. This is the same case. In contrast to the Bresha, we had chut sheviroi al gabi argomon. We're now talking about an arrangement where you, to protect the argomon, the expensive wool that you're weaving, you actually don't just throw or put or place some threads on top. You actually weave, you actually interlace those chutim with the woven beged. Maybe you will remove them, but they are interwoven, they're interlaced, and therefore because they're interlaced, they are called a chibur to the beged. Now we're going to that little loop which is sticking out after you've woven the beged, which I've marked as F, where the loop is very small. you're not going to snip it off. What you're going to do is just going to pull it inside. That's called the irashiach sidol achazira. That is mechuber to the beged. And by touching, if the beged is tomei, touching that little loop, you become tomei. Next bit of the Mishnah. And now we're going to leave the weaving process. We're now going over to the spinning process, a long way before the weaving process. And the way you spin is you have your unspun wool wrapped round a pole. That pole, says the Mishnah, is called an ima or an ashvuya. Different shapes have different names. Not quite sure what the differences between an ima and ashvuya is. Basically, you have your little rod, which you put under your shoulder, under your armpit, and you have all your unspun wool wrapped around it, and then you pull away from that rod, you then pull away wool and you start spinning it with your hands. We're now dealing with the ima and the ashvuya being, if they are tomei, is the tsemer and the pishton, which is the unspun tsemer and pishton, which is wrapped around those rods, is that tsemer and pishton a chibur to the rod? Says the Mishnah, no. If you touch the tsemer, which is wrapped around the ima or the ashvuya, and the ima and the ashvuya is tomei, then touching the tsemer is not a chibur and you are tahor. Next case, the last case. When you spun the wool, you're spinning the wool, where does the spun wool go? It goes round a spindle, which is a long rod this way. So the spindle hangs down, and you wind your spun wool round the spindle. Right. The spindle has to have a weight. So what you do is, you put a ball, the ball has a hole in it, and you slide the ball with a hole in over the spindle, and it rests at the bottom of the spindle, and then that gives it weight. That ball is called a pico. The spindle is called a perech, and the ball is called a pico. Says the Mishnah, when you spun the wool, so you've got your spindle, and you've got your big ball, the pico at the bottom, and we're discussing the chibur of the pico of the ball to the rod, to the perech. Says the Mishnah, touching the pico, assuming the pelech is tomei. Does touching the ball, the pico, is that a chibur to the pelech which is tomei? Says the Mishnah, it depends. Ad shalai pira or tomei. If you spun the wool all the way around, lots and lots of wool being spun round this rod and the ball, and it's spun and it's wrapped round the ball as well. Ad shalai pira, you haven't yet revealed the pico, you haven't yet taken off the spun wool, then the pico is a chibur to the pelech. However, Mishapira, once you've removed the spun wool, and now the pico is just lying loose on the pelech, then the pelech is now going to be removed. The pelech is no longer a chibur to the pico, and therefore, if the pelech is tomei, touching the pico, you will be tahor. Baruch Hashem, we've done that Mishnah.